there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making a coping sled for your router table. Well, a little while back on my Rail in Style video on the show, I had a viewer, Robert, comment about using a coping sled. And while I did make a little makeshift sled to route the end grains of the stock in that show, a good way to do it is with a coping sled. And what a coping sled does is it allows you to be able to hold a thin piece of stock like that securely for running it through the router table, but it also allows you, with that thin end grain cut, it allows you to be able to keep that piece of stock square to your router bit, which is very important when running through rail and stiles. So we're going to make one on today's show, and we're going to start off with the base piece of the project. Well, what we're going to start off with for the base is a piece of 1/2 inch thick plywood, and we're going to have it at 11.5 inches by 15 inches. So before we do any cutting whatsoever, I just want to make the point here that you're making a jig, and a jig is meant to do repetitive motions on a certain machine. Please check your blades for square, check your cuts that they're square, because at this point the preparation that you take to make the jig and make sure that everything is square will go a long way to making sure that your jig is 100% usable. Any imperfections that you make in your cuts now, whether it be alignment, squareness, what have you, those imperfections will transfer onto your work pieces. So make sure you check it all, guys, and let's cut a piece of that 1/2 inch thick plywood, 15 inches by 11.5. Well, now that we have our base piece cut, we want to do a little bit of layout. And this particular coping sled has a 3/4 inch wide dado that runs right across on the 11.5 inch side, and that is going to house a replaceable piece of MDF in this particular jig. And that replaceable piece of MDF, of course, will help with the tear out when routing the end grain of your stock. So marking from the 11.5 inch side along the 15 inch side, we want to come in 5.5 inches. So I'm just going to place a mark there at 5.5 inches, and this is going to be the placement of our dado. So we're going to cut a dado here, 3/4 of an inch thick, and it will be 1/8 of an inch deep. So now that we've done that, we're going to cut some material for our miter bar. And for this, I'm going to be using some plastic. So for the miter bar, I'm going to use some UHMW plastic. And I've got it cut to a rough shape here, which is, for my miter slot, is 3/4 of an inch. I've cut it just a little bit larger, and I'm fine-tuning it to bring it down to the final dimension so that it is nice and snug in that miter slot. We don't want any play at all, left or right. So take extra time to do this right and get a perfectly fitting miter bar. This is 15 inches long, which is the size that you're going to need. And then once I'm done fine-tuning it, I'm happy with the fit. I'm going to measure the depth of my miter slot and then cut this or rip this to be just a little less than the depth of the miter slot, and that'll give us a nice, perfectly sized miter bar for our sled. Now, before you proceed any further, just make sure that what you have cut for your miter bar fits nicely into the miter slot. And I mean, that is a perfect fit. There is no play whatsoever to either side of this, and it slides nice and smooth throughout the track. That's the kind of miter bar that you want for this jig. No play and nice and smooth. It fills pretty much the entire miter slot with just a little bit of slack here, so it's a little below the surface, but that's fine because once we actually mount it to our jig and to our base plate, that's going to pull it up and it'll give some nice sliding room down underneath should there be wood chips in there or what have you. So let's go back to the base plate now that we have our miter bar cut and sized, and we're going to do some more layout marks. Well, now it's time for us to put some layout lines on here to cut the shape of our platform. And this is our 5.5 inch side right here. And the first thing we're going to start off with is a line at 3.5 inches. Just like that. And once we get that line drawn, we're going to come in 5 inches on our platform, and this section will be cut out. We're going to put a nice radius there, maybe 1.25 inch radius, and that'll be cut out and it'll look just great. And then once we're done with this section, we want to place another cutout mark over in this area. Well, just like we did on this side here, we're going to come in 5 inches from this one edge. I've spun the board around just so you can see it a little better. So we're going to come in 5 inches and draw another layout line there. That particular mark will now be brought in 2 3/4 inch. Once I find it here, there it is. So 2 3/4 inches back, 5 inches in from the edge of the board, and we want to come back from this edge here at 5.5, just like that. And once we get those lines or marks drawn, we're going to join these two marks here. So the one at 2 3/4 in and our 5.5 inches in, we're going to join these together just like that. And just like I said, I'm going to get a circle template and round these corners over to make them a little nicer looking, and then we're going to cut this out on the scroll saw. Now, because I'm not sure how well it showed up on the camera, let me pan away from my ugly mug and just show you the final layout lines that we've got for this cutting. And there they are. So you can see how it is that we want to cut it. And I don't really think you guys need a video on how to cut this out on the scroll saw. It's some pretty straightforward cutting. So once I get that cut, we're going to move forward in the project and work on mounting our miter bar. Well, if you've been following up till now, you should have a base plate that looks like this. And with our miter slot, it will get mounted something along those lines, but of course on the bottom. I'm just showing you here. We need to drill some mounting holes. So 1 inch in and 5 inches in from each end, we're going to drill some mounting holes and countersink them for our screws. Now, I can't tell you what size screws to use. You can use whatever you have available, but you want to make sure that they're long enough to securely attach your miter bar to the underside, but not so long that they come right through your work platform. So let's head over to the router table and I'll show you how we're going to mount this miter bar. Well, I'm going to use my fence to help me line up my miter bar onto my jig. And I've set the edge of the fence so that it is 1 inch out from the center of the router bit. That way we don't have an issue once we get our miter bar in there. We won't have an issue with our jig contacting our router bit. And I just have my rail and style bit put into place just as a test to make sure that that measurement is correct. What I've done as well is gone through and I used a combination square in the miter slot to make sure and check and double check all the way along to make sure that this fence is in fact square and it is the exact same distance on all sides here, both in feed and out feed from the miter slot. So now that we have the fence set up and checked and double checked, and we are absolutely sure that this is running parallel with the miter slot, now we can get our miter bar and install it on our jig bed. Well, this isn't any kind of crazy rocket science, and this sure isn't any kind of sorcery. It's just a simple process to be able to mount your bar on here. Now that we have the fence set, I have the miter bar here, and I'm just going to sit it in our miter slot, and I've already got our mounting holes drilled and countersunk from underneath, and I've placed some double-sided carpet tape here, and that's the little trick that's going to help me mount this correctly. So I'm going to use my fence to help me with alignment. I'm going to line up the plate of my jig with the back edge of this miter bar, and once I get everything lined up nicely and I'm happy with that alignment, I'm just going to sit it in place and push it down onto our jig bed, just like that. And once we get it there in place, we can pull this off, and the double-sided tape will help to stick it to the bottom of our jig bed, and from there it will hold in place until we can get our mounting screws, which, by the way, I'm using number 6 by 3/4 inches long. Just a little tip for you: if you're having problems getting your miter slot to adhere with the carpet tape because it's recessed, throw a couple of washers like what I've done here into the miter slot just to raise it up enough to get that carpet tape to get some adhesion on your back strip. Well, now that we've got the miter slot or the miter bar in place, it's all screwed down. I left that packing tape in there, obviously. That's going to help with adhesion. And we can just sit this in our miter slot and give it a test as far as how easily it slides. It's nice and tight. It slides well. It shouldn't give us any problems once we finish the jig. Well, now that we've got this platform finished, we can put this aside now, and we're going to move on to building the fence. Well, the first step in constructing our fence for this project will be to construct or cut our disposable backing piece. And for that, we're going to cut it out of 3/4 inch thick MDF, and it's going to be 1.5 inches wide and 13 inches long. Well, with our sacrificial piece cut, it will just sit in this dado that we cut earlier, and these pieces, of course, will be replaceable as you use the jig. They're meant to be disposable. They're meant to prevent tear out. But now we want to actually build the the entire fence that will back on to this disposable piece. And for that, we're going to use a piece of hardwood. I'm going to go with maple, I believe, once I check the rack and see that I have a piece up there. But it's going to be 1 5/8 of an inch thick. We're going to need it 3 3/8 wide, and it'll be 11.5 inches long, which will coincide with the width of our coping jig. Well, now that we have this big chunk of maple cut, we need to take a notch out of it, and the reason for that notch is that this particular piece, which is our sacrificial piece, is actually going to be inset in our fence. So for that, we're going to want a notch taken out of this piece here that is a 1/2 inch deep, and we want it to be 1 11/16 tall. So I'm going to cut that, and then I'll show you how this fits together. And I know it's going to seem strange the way it fits together, but there's more to come, so don't jump the gun on me, guys. Well, we have the slot or groove or the rabbet, whatever you want to call this thing, cut out of our main fence. And I remind you again to keep checking for square to make sure that your board is nice and flat, your edges are square, so that everything is coming together properly, because those inconsistencies, as I said, will get transferred onto your project. So the next thing that we really need here is some UHMW plastic again. And this is going to add to our jig. And we're going to need 2 pieces, and one of them is going to be 1 15/16 wide, and the other one is going to be a 1/2 inch wide. Both of them will be 11.5 inches long, and they will both be out of 1/4 inch thick material. The pieces of plastic are cut, and let me just show you how this comes together. Your disposable piece will sit in the dado just like that, and your fence, this will get mounted onto our baseboard just like this. Well, this little thin piece of plastic actually mounts under here, and it will secure in place. And what we're going to have is a couple of threaded rods or turn screws that will come down through here and force this plastic down onto our sacrificial piece, and it will hold it tightly in place. And this here, our next piece of plastic, this will become the front of our fence. Now, what you should be looking for here is a nice flat surface, a mating surface between your MDF and your plastic. It shouldn't be out of whack. It should all be in the same level. So now that we have our pieces cut for the fence, I'm going to drill a bunch of holes throughout this entire piece here and mount our plastic onto the front of our jig fence. We do need to make a taper, so we're going to draw that out first just to make sure that we're not putting screws where our taper goes. Well, I've drawn the taper on the front of the fence, and the measurements here are 4 3/4 from the edge and 1 1/2 inches down. So we're going to leave this intact for now, but pay attention when you're mounting your plastic on there that you're not putting screws in this area. Once we get our plastic mounted properly and cleanly on the front of this, then I'm going to mark this on the plastic, cut it with the bandsaw, and then just finish it off with the disc sander. We have the plastic mounted onto our fence, and the taper is done and trimmed to the measurements I gave you earlier. Now it's time to drill a couple of 1/2 inch deep holes. We're going to put them 1/2 inch back from our fence. They're going to be 1/2 inch deep, and we need to put in some 1/4 20 threaded inserts. So for this being maple, I'm going to drill a 3/8 hole down through here, 1/2 inch deep, and then I'm going to carry on with a 5/16 through hole that will come right out into this groove here. As well, our 1/2 inch wide piece of 1/4 inch plastic, we needed to drill a couple holes here and countersink them. And we've done that. We mounted them or drilled them at 2 1/4 and 3 1/4 inches in from this left edge. So once we get these holes done here, we are going to put those threaded inserts in, and I'll show you what the idea is behind this at that point in time. So 3/8 hole, 1/2 inch deep for your threaded inserts, 15/16 all the way down through. This hole is 1/2 inch back from the front, and they are measured in at, this is at 1 inch, and this one here comes in at 4.5 from the left edge of the fence. So with those holes drilled, we'll just put these threaded inserts into our 3/8 holes and crank them down until they are flush with the stock. Just like that. So put them both in, and then we'll move on to what to do about the hardware that screws into this. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this week. One of the drawbacks of having a show that provides extra information during a build is that sometimes we run out of time and can't complete a project on the first show. But that's okay, because we can continue it next week. There's never a rush in woodworking, guys. I hope that you've enjoyed this show, and I also hope that you're going to enjoy me next week when I bring you part 2 of the coping sled build and yet another woodworking video.